Hi, welcome to Sabbath School Daily, where we have been studying from this lesson right here, God's Mission, My Mission. This week we're studying from lesson number 9, which has the title Mission to the Powerful, and today is Tuesday's lesson, which has the title Witnessing to the Learned, Nicodemus. Today's lesson is about one of my favorite stories in the New Testament. I would say that between the stories of Nicodemus, Zacchaeus, and the rich young ruler, those are probably some of my favorite stories in the whole of the New Testament. Some of the best encounters of Jesus, where we learn not only about the person, but about Jesus Christ himself as he reveals himself to these people. The story of Nicodemus appears in John chapter 3. The book of John is a very interesting book. It's different from the other three gospels in that it's not being written to a specific group of people in terms of an ethnicity, right? The book of Matthew is written to the Jews. The book of Mark is being written to the Romans. The book of Luke is being written to the Greeks. But the book of John is being written to the Christian church at the end of the first century, which are facing several external and internal problems. And so it's a very intentional book. Not that the other ones aren't, but its intentionality is a little bit different. In this book, you'll see that Jesus, he meets several people individually. The meeting with Nicodemus cannot be disassociated from the meeting with the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. So just remember that. John chapter 3 and chapter 4, they go together because they describe the extremities of God's ability and desire to reach different people. On one side, you have a man, you have a Pharisee, you have a part of the Sanhedrin, you have power, you have wealth, you have influence, you have intellect. This was a learned man, as the lesson tells us. And then in John chapter 4, you have this encounter with the exact opposite. Here you have him ministering to a woman, Samaritan, probably not learned, not powerful, not influential, low reputation, and that's where you see the breadth of God's desire to save. In any case, here in John chapter 3, you have this fascinating story of this rabbi that approaches Jesus in the dead of night to talk to him, to question him, to ask him questions, and to learn from him. First thing is that he appears in the dead of night. He doesn't come to Jesus in the broad daylight because he was scared. He was fearful of what that could do to his reputation. At the same time, he does meet Jesus. He is so fascinated that he cannot not meet Christ. And here he approaches Jesus with all types of flattery. He says, "Rabbi, we know that you are a prophet that has been sent from God." How did he know? Well, it's very likely that he saw the miracles that are spoken of in John chapter 2. And so here he approaches Christ, asking him these questions. He approaches him with flattery. But it's interesting how Jesus deals with him because Jesus answers his question that hadn't even been asked. He goes straight to the heart of the matter and he says, "Nicodemus, you must be born again." Now that must have been a slap to Nicodemus's face because Nicodemus, he came and he wasn't really expecting that. After all, this unorthodox rabbi, Jesus, he was a lot younger than Nicodemus and he was a lot different than what Nicodemus had expected. I'm sure that if Jesus had told Nicodemus to do more, to put on more laws regarding the Sabbath, to pay more tithe, to give more offerings, those were things that Nicodemus could understand. But contrary to that, Jesus goes to the heart of the matter and tells him that he had to be born again. We see that Nicodemus, he asks Jesus a question. He says, "Well, how can that be? How can a man go back to the womb of his mother? That won't work." Sometimes we don't really give Nicodemus enough credit. Here, Nicodemus, he's not misunderstanding what Jesus is saying. He's not thinking that Jesus is suggesting that he had to literally be born again. This is a man that was trained in the rhetoric, in the imagery of Jewish tradition and Jewish scripture. He understood what Jesus was saying. And so in his answer, he's asking Jesus truly, well, how can this be? How can I go back? How could I have a reputation to uphold? How can I start over again? I can't just start following you. I can't truly begin or start or be born again, because that would mean going back on everything that he was, everything that he represented. Nicodemus represents the midnight disciples, those who don't come to Jesus, obviously, those who don't come to Jesus at once. Nicodemus's birth would take still a few years. We'll see that it took Nicodemus still a few years to come to the Lord. In John chapter 7, we see that he defends Jesus. In John chapter 19, finally, he stands for his crucified Lord, and that in a moment where even the disciples fled, the disciples ran away. But in John chapter 3, in dealing with Nicodemus, truly we find some of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, some of the deepest imagery of the Bible. We find quotes such as John chapter 3, verse 16, one of the most famous verses in the entire Christian faith. We'll also find the reference of the bronze serpent that was raised by Moses to save the children of Israel from the bites of the serpents. In any case, it's an extremely beautiful and extremely deep chapter of the Bible. I encourage you to read it. I'm sure that you will glean a lot from it. If you have any questions about this chapter, about what's going on in their conversation, write it down below and I'd love to address it with you. But truly, this chapter is, in essence, about a man who had everything: power, influence, honor, riches, but something was missing. Because while he had all of that, he didn't feel fulfilled. In the conversation, he has to recognize that while he had the diplomas, it was Christ who had the power, Christ who had the authority. And that's why ultimately he does submit to Jesus Christ's authority. While the Bible doesn't mention what happened to Nicodemus, early church tradition does tell us that he finally gave his life to the Lord and he was a missionary and he died the death of a martyr. If that's true or not, we'll only know when we get to heaven, but I find it interesting that that's how Christian tradition spoke and understood the rest of the life of Nicodemus. In any case, please read your lesson. There's a lot to be learned and gleaned when it comes to ministering to rich and powerful people, in this case, even religious powerful people, influential people, and we can be used by God to reach everyone, even those who aren't in that condition, in that situation. Study your lesson, look up the Bible verses, read the texts that will give you more insight. Also, please remember to comment down below with any questions or any comments. I'd love to interact with you. And please remember to like, to share, and to subscribe to our videos. We release one every day, and I hope to see you again here tomorrow for another Sabbath School day.